or that he wanted my mom. He wanted me. He just knew he had to make sure that she was, in a state of romantic early infatuation. My parents are human beings, that's for sure. They didn't do it all perfect, and they will never forgive themselves for those things that they themselves did, but they didn't do it knowing that he had hurt me.
Is that the case, Marianne, that you don't forgive yourself for
true. That is very true. I still look back on that and wonder what kind of a cloud was over my brain that I could not see. Jan wouldn't talk about anything like that. He never did anything to me.
He was always after my mother. Let's just put it that way. His story was, Marianne, you're the only one I've ever wanted. I want you to leave Bob. I want to have a life with you. Bring the girls. I'll get you set up in a place, and I want to leave my wife. That was the story with my mom.
In the meantime, this case still hasn't come to court, and B is still out. You are still getting messages at night, occasionally, from these aliens, Jan.
Yes, that happened several times.
How was that happening?
So, of course, Berchtold knew my family home intimately. He'd been there a million times. He knew exactly how to get in. And what I know happened was that he got into my house, set up the little speaker box. The box would turn on. I would wake up, terrified of that voice, that staccato, high-pitched monotone voice. And then within, several minutes, there was Berchtold standing in my doorway of my bedroom. And I do remember him always having just his socks on. I don't know why that image is in my mind, but he never had shoes. He was always in his socks. And then the voice would come and he would get in bed with me and do the mission, as I call it. That only happened a couple of times during that year. But I would get messages from people at school, kids. We called them, the druggies, the hoods. They'd give me some note that would tell me, to ride my bike to this phone booth on such and such corner and just sit on the floor of the phone booth until it rang. It would be either Berchtold on the other end of the line, or it would be that voice, that alien staccato voice giving me instructions.
How do you feel when you spoke to B or saw B?
I feel like he is in this with me, like I'm supposed to be with him because of this mission. The clock is ticking. I'm, turning 13, and now I'm turning 14. And in that year and a half, I had never told anybody because I thought I would be vaporized. I believed completely that I was still being watched by them all day, every day. I didn't have a relationship with my dad. I pushed him away. I wouldn't talk to boys at school. The aliens had told me not to have relationships with any other males. I was all saving myself for the male companion.
Were you afraid?
Yes, I was terrified. I spent my whole early teenage years in a constant state of fear.
In the end, B took a plea bargain and served only 2 weeks in jail for kidnapping Jan. He hadn't been out long when, in August 1976, Jan disappeared again. She'd been told what to do by the voices in the tape recorder that would appear by her bed at night, and what she believed to be aliens.
They had instructed me to write a letter to my parents, and on a certain agreed upon night and time at 2 a.m, after staging a big fight with my parents, I wrote this note, and I opened one of my bedroom windows in that back bedroom, and I went out through that window, and B, Berchtold, was there in his car, and he took me a second time, and this time drove me to California.
Where he enrolled you in a Catholic school under a false name and pretended that he was your father and a CIA agent, and that people might come looking for you, but they meant you harm.
Exactly.
And that's where you were.
Yes.
Marianne, you knew nothing of that. You just knew your little girl was gone again. What did that do to you?
Oh, my goodness. Felt devastated. We knew Jan was preoccupied with something going on, but we did not have any clue that she had been communicating with Berchtold. That was out of reach because we knew he had threatened some time back after the Mexico thing that he said, I will have her one way or another.
And that at that point is when my mother cut everything off with him. So both my mom and dad are now on the same page. Neither of them have any idea that he has sexually abused me, but now his threats have become, I'm going to have her. And so when I'm missing, all of a sudden, again, they knew it had to have been him, but it was gut-wrenching. It was devastating. I don't know that my dad ever got out of bed the second time.
It took 3 months for the FBI to track Jan down to the school in California. B was charged with impersonating a CIA agent and spent 3 months in a mental facility. He still managed to get to Jan and to abuse her without anyone realizing. Jan was painfully aware that she was approaching her 16th birthday, by which time she'd been brainwashed into believing she was meant to have had a child with B.
I was scared. As that approached, I still believe the mission. I'm still not talking to boys at school. And I go to a theater camp away from home because that's what saved me in a lot of ways, was that I could get on stage and cry and scream and be somebody else and have emotions that I couldn't have in my real life because I had to do what I had to do. And so at that theater camp, I had made a plan. I knew where my dad had purchased a gun, which was very unlike him, but I knew it was under the bed. And I had decided that I would get through the theater camp and the play, and then I would tell my sister, Susan, about the mission, because I obviously wasn't pregnant. I still hadn't gone through puberty. And if she didn't want to do that mission, that I would kill her and then I would kill myself. I feel this pressure of the world now. I've been trying to save a dying planet for almost 4 years of my childhood. I think it's all real. I absolutely have never told a soul one thing, nobody. So as I'm going through this camp, a boy in one of my scenes in the play develops this crush on me, and I can tell, but I avoid him, except when I have to do the scene with him. And we go to a bowling alley where there's an ice cream bar, and he pays for my ice cream. And I am horrified, and I just know something terrible is now going to happen. I go back to my dorm room. I throw myself on the bed. I'm bawling my eyes out. My parents call me every day. And I tell my mom when she calls me, I ask her all these questions like, where's Susan? Well, she's here. Where's Karen? Where's Dad? Where are the dogs? Well, the dogs are here. They're a little sick. I think I fed them something bad. Well, I start bawling. Oh, they're going to die. They're going to die. My mom is like, what? By the time we hang up the call, I am hysterical. And by the next morning, when she calls me again, she says, hey, the dogs are good. They're doing fine. And I'm like, and Dad's okay? Yeah, he just left for work. And Susan and Karen, yep, everybody's good. We're just excited to come and see you in the show next weekend. So at that moment, I have the first thought in my mind ever that goes like this. Before I tell Susan and kill her or kill myself, I better make sure that they are real. And then, right after that thought, I have this thought. I'm just kidding. I know you're real. I'll do whatever you tell me. Please don't hurt my family. Because that's how a brainwashed person thinks. But because I had that first moment of wanting to make sure it was real, the first time I had questioned it, I was able to start doing little things that would test to see if that was real. So as I got back home, we're going into our, junior year of high school, and I still haven't been on a date. I decide I'm going to talk to a boy. And I do these little things over the course of the next several months as school starts, and I accept a date to the homecoming dance. And I know if I can come home from that date and my dad isn't dead or missing, my sister Susan isn't missing, Karen isn't blind, I'll know. I'll know that this isn't true. And sure enough, I went to the date, and who was waiting up for me when I got home but my dad in his big easy chair. And I will never forget coming home, and he was there, and he was breathing. And he asked me, "Hey, how was it? Tell me about it. My first date." And I did, and tried not to, collapse or cry. And then that was the beginning of me trying to figure out, how would I tell anybody?
Jan found the courage to tell her sister, her best friend, and then her parents. Not about the sexual abuse, she wouldn't talk about that until years later, but about the fear of aliens that had gripped her for 4 years. What did that do to you as a mother, to realise what your child had been going through?
I just cried. I couldn't believe what she had been through. It was so hard to understand. And I know that it was my fault. It was my fault that she was feeling this way. And I should have done more.
Or seen
But
it.
I didn't.
You didn't know.
That's right. I didn't know.
But you felt completely responsible.
Oh, I did. I felt terrible. So hurt that she had to suffer this without any support to help her through those difficult times.
It's clear that you've forgiven her, Jan.
Oh, clearly. Yes, I have totally forgiven her.
How did you all go about recovering that, I suppose, that trust and security and love that had been there before?
It's interesting because from my perspective as a child, I was so lucky that I had literally 12 of the most idyllic childhood years before all of this happened. I had a foundation that I had experienced unconditional love from both of my parents. Even through the years of barely talking to my dad, I had shoved him off and ignored him and staged fights with him. And I got nothing back except, "I don't know what's wrong, Janny, but I love you. You're my Janny," and it never changed. So I had that to build back. And of course, I had to go through some counseling, and through some years, I did a lot of writing. And I got so furious with my parents, and I called them and I screamed at them, and I was so angry. Why didn't you know? Why didn't you see? But again, what I got back from my parents was, "We're so sorry. We take all the responsibility for not knowing more, for not being more educated, for not seeing." But they didn't make excuses to me. They just apologized. They just loved me.
Your dad has passed away. Did he forgive himself before he died?
My dad was such a deeply religious man that I think he had a very hard time ever forgiving himself. I think he tried, he went through what I would call steps of repentance, but I feel like he continued to kind of carry that weight. Why didn't I see through him? How is it that somebody can look so wonderful and honest and real and be just absolutely the total opposite?
Jan and Marianne discovered later that B had abused several other girls. He killed himself in 2005 while awaiting sentencing for a felony charge. Mother and daughter have made it their goal to raise awareness of child sexual abuse and how to spot the signs of grooming. They've written books and done speaking tours, and Jan has fulfilled her childhood ambition to become an actor in film and television. So you've made the life you wanted.
Yeah, we have. Yeah. Right, Mom?
Yes, you're right.
We feel very, very grateful and very blessed and very almost obligated, right?
Yeah,
Mom's crying again. She's got tears rolling down her face. We feel like we really do want to hopefully help someone else.
Jan and Marianne Broberg. Details of organisations offering information and support for victims of child sexual abuse are available online at bbc.co.uk/support. /action line. Thanks for listening today. We're back same time tomorrow. Now on the BBC World Service, witness history with me, Rebecca Kesby. And all this week we're looking back 10 years at the momentous events that became known as the Arab Spring, when mass popular uprisings took hold across the Middle East and North Africa. In Syria, one of the most oppressive regimes in the region, it all began with a simple call for freedom. In 2016, I spoke to someone who took part in one of the very first anti-government protests in the country.
I don't know how to convey this exactly, but for Syrians, it was really a dream that we would ever see any sort of change or anyone saying no to the government for anything. The government could literally undergo any action it wanted. Kidnap people, kill people, torture people, and there was no one that could say no.
In the spring of 2011, Rami Jarrah lived with his wife and daughter in central Damascus. He was an import-export consultant for a distribution company.
In Syria, life was very closed off and very isolated from the rest of the world. There was this system that was on the surface that looked like it was all clean and legit, but under that, there was a tight grip from the intelligence. People were scared of even uttering the president's name, his father's name, any problems they had with the government. There were bribes. If you had a newborn child and you wanted to register your son, it would be this process that if you didn't pay a bribe, then you wouldn't get them registered. Daily life in Syria was corrupt in every sense.
But as protest and revolution began sweeping across the Middle East, Rami was one of those who dared to hope that change might even come to Syria.
It definitely gave us hope, seeing that was happening, and it was what ignited a lot of people that then began handing out in the streets flyers. They would throw these flyers in the streets and then run away, knock on people's doors and throw a piece of paper in front of the door that would say on it, you have the right to say no. These are people calling for their rights. The first protest I took part in was on the 18th of March, and it was in the old city of Damascus. It was called the Syrian Day of Rage. And it was to take place inside this ancient mosque called the Umayyad Mosque. Now, it being a mosque at the time was not an issue that Syrians didn't look at it as it being anything that would then become an Islamic revolution in any sense. The reason being is because a mosque was really the only place that you could gather in large numbers without the government questioning and saying, well, what's going on here? So to put together a protest, that means you need numbers, you need people to actually gather in some square, and that's impossible in Syria. That's why it was inside that mosque. There were many checkpoints on the way there because the government was very aware that there were these calls for protests. I was stopped at about 6 checkpoints. Heading into the mosque, we went inside, and then the cleric who was giving the speech was actually saying that there's a conspiracy and no one should answer any of these calls. I looked around me. The people that were sitting on the carpet of the mosque were yawning, and it seemed as if nothing was going to happen. And I thought immediately that second, I'm not going to be the one to stand up and say anything and expose myself because maybe the people here are supportive of Assad, I don't know. And just as the speech was coming to an end, an old man we saw just run up these steps towards the imam that was speaking and then shouted into the crowd, "My children are in prison and I want freedom for them." And he screamed it again, "I want freedom for them." And everyone around me, I realized there was this moment of silence, and then a few people in the back of the room stood up and started screaming. There was a crowd of about 1,000 people that were inside the mosque that then started shouting freedom.
Rami managed to record some of the chanting that day inside the mosque on his mobile phone.
We know that this was such a dangerous situation. We know that the punishment for this would be death. But I can say for that moment, those few moments that we were able to actually participate in that protest, it was a feeling of total disconnection from your body, a sort of high that you could finally say, I don't accept this. And you were seeing people around you that were also saying, I don't accept this. And there was this very sort of humble feeling when you would look into someone's eyes around you. It was this sudden moment of safety, and that was impossible to feel in Syria at any time. It was a feeling of ecstasy. And I know that's hard to relate to. I know that me saying this sounds like poetry, and someone that lives in Europe or lives in the United States or somewhere else around the world would think, it's just a protest. What's with that? But it really isn't. It's really a moment where you break those barriers. And once you're able to do that, it's a feeling of dignity. There was one man that said, the first moment I screamed freedom was the first moment I sensed that I had any dignity for myself. And that's because Syrians, for many years, walked around and lived with their heads down low, not allowed to say anything or express anything. But it came to an end very quickly because the government retaliated immediately with extreme force. It took about 10 minutes until this protest was attacked by a much larger group of people, and that was that group of people that were outside the mosque, who then began arresting people and dragging them onto buses, and it was a very bloody scene. When we came out of the mosque, I ran through this old market, it's called the Hamadiyya market, and made it out onto the newer part of the city. My cousin's shop was right opposite the entrance, and I went to him, and he said to me, do you know what else just happened? He said, Daraa, which is another city, has just basically, people have risen in Daraa.
Reports from Syria say at least 3 people were killed and scores injured in clashes between protesters and security personnel in the city of Daraa. State media spoke of troops having to intervene following acts of violence and sabotage by what were described as infiltrators.
Witnesses said police acted against demonstrators calling for freedom and an end to corruption.
And this is when we knew that there are people in different cities that had participated in this. So it was a relief that we did actually have people that were willing to say no and were willing to stand up for their rights. I was arrested on the 25th of March, and I was subject to torture. I was beaten with a crowbar to my torso, my legs. I wasn't allowed to sleep for 3 days. I was kept standing on my feet for that whole time. And any time I would fall, they would throw water that was mixed with something, and I don't know what it was, but I was thinking maybe bleach, and they would throw it on me. And the fact that I hadn't drank anything at one stage meant that I actually tried to drink it, and I choked, and I almost died. A friend of mine that was there was electrocuted severely. It was hell. It was hell on earth, and we could hear people screaming everywhere. I was one of those people.
Rami was only released after signing documents that falsely incriminated him as a foreign spy.
When we're released, what they expect is that we're broken individuals, that they will be quiet. But in Syria, after so many years of oppression, when I was released, it just made me much more determined to be more organized. That's the only thing that did to me, and I think to a lot of Syrians.
In the months that followed, the regime of Bashar al-Assad continued to violently suppress countless peaceful protests. Thousands were arrested and tortured. Some went missing. Eventually, a number of prominent officers deserted from the military and began an armed resistance. The country sank into a desperate civil war. But extremists emerged from the chaos and for years dominated entire areas with tyranny and violence. Foreign powers intervened, but Bashar al-Assad has remained in power. Rami says the Syrian suffering is deep.
The trauma that the Syrian people have undergone, it's so extreme, but I think we have to maintain some type of hope. If there are people that are still saying we won't accept neither extremism nor dictatorship, then there's always going to be a space in which those people will be able to live. And I'm hoping that place is Syria. I hope so.
Rami Jarrah speaking to me, Rebecca Kesby, back in 2016 for Witness History. And if you'd like to hear more first-hand accounts from the past, just search online for BBC Witness History.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, and here's what's happening in the studio this week.
I'm Elizabeth Holker, and I'll be meeting the composer Max Richter and his creative partner Yulia Marr to explore Voices, one of Max's most ambitious and profound pieces. It's inspired by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
In the studio. Today at 23:30 GMT. And there's a full roundup of today's sports news in 30 minutes. Here's Adiada Doyne.
Manchester City can move to the top of the Premier League table for the first time this season. They're away at West Bromwich Albion, one of 4 matches in England's top flight. We'll also be looking ahead to the Milan derby and reflecting on an enthralling opening day of a test match between Pakistan and South Africa.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
At 19 hours GMT, this is the newsroom from the BBC World Service. I'm Gareth Barlow. In the UK, a sombre day.
It's 100,000 people whose families are going to miss them for the rest of their lives, really.
These are people. They're not just numbers. This is a life that's gone.
The UK is the first European nation to pass 100,000 deaths linked to COVID-19. Also to come in the next half hour, the EU threatens to restrict exports of COVID vaccines made within its borders. Indian farmers clash with police over planned reforms. Joe Biden continues to overturn the legacy of Donald Trump with 2 key appointments. And
it's important that our notes reflect the history and diversity of our country, and Harriet Tubman's image gracing the new $20 note would certainly reflect that.
Born into slavery, now poised to be on a banknote, we'll hear about the life and legacy of Harriet Tubman. This is the BBC.
Hello, this is Julie Candler with the BBC News. More than 100,000 people in the UK have now died with COVID-19, the highest number in Europe. Britain's Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty warned there would be a lot more deaths before the impact of a vaccination programme was felt. Rob Watson reports.
The Prime Minister Boris Johnson marked the passing of the 100,000th death by saying it was hard to compute the sorrow in what he called such a grim statistic. He said he took full responsibility for every decision taken, while insisting his government had done all it could to save lives. Critics will disagree and say Mr Johnson was too slow to impose lockdowns and did a poor job of protecting homes for the elderly and setting up an effective track and trace system.
The veteran diplomat Antony Blinken has been confirmed as US Secretary of State in a Senate vote. A strong majority of senators backed President Biden's nominee. Janet Yellen has also been sworn in as the first woman to lead the US Treasury. From Washington, here's Barbara Pletasher.
Antony Blinken is taking over the helm of U.S. foreign policy after years of turmoil at the State Department under the Trump administration. He is a strong advocate of strengthening international alliances to further U.S. interests, in contrast to the nationalist America First policies of President Trump. He told senators during his confirmation hearing that that would be his priority, and he was confirmed with strong bipartisan support. He comes with a wealth of diplomatic experience and faces daunting global challenges.
The new US envoy to the UN says President Biden's administration intends to restore aid to the Palestinians, which President Trump had cut off. Addressing a Security Council debate, Richard Mills said America would continue to urge more Muslim countries to normalize their ties with Israel. But he said this would not be a substitute for an Israeli-Palestinian peace. The Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari has replaced his most senior military chiefs as the country's security problems deepen. Mr. Buhari gave no reason for the change of personnel. In a tweet, he said he'd accepted the immediate resignation of the head of the defence staff, along with the chiefs of the Army, Air Force and Navy. From Abuja, Isaac Khalid has more details.
The president thanked the outgoing officers for what he called their overwhelming achievements in bringing peace to Nigeria. Security was a key election pledge by President Buhari, but the situation has worsened in recent years. He has faced significant criticism for his government's failure to defeat the militant group Boko Haram, as well as the growth of criminal gangs regularly carrying out kidnapping for ransom. In December, more than 300 boys were kidnapped from their school in northern Nigeria before they were later released following negotiations with the abductors.
World News from the BBC. Tunisian police have blocked the path of hundreds of demonstrators who were trying to reach parliament in the capital, Tunis. The crowd was protesting against the political elite and the behaviour of the police. There's been anger at the arrest of more than 1,000 people during recent unrest across the country. The Indian government says it's deploying additional paramilitary forces in the capital, Delhi, after a day of violent protests by farmers angry at new agricultural laws. Thousands of farmers fought pitched battles with police after an organised demonstration descended into chaos. The authorities say more than 80 officers were injured. One farmer died. A Polish man who was at the centre of a row between Poland and the UK over a decision to remove his life support has died in an English hospital. He was in a vegetative state after a cardiac arrest. His wife, the hospital and a British court had all agreed that he should be moved into palliative care. But estranged family members and the Polish government objected, saying that as a Roman Catholic, his right to life must be preserved. Archaeologists in Portugal are celebrating the discovery in Lisbon of a 17th century ship, which they say is better preserved than any previous such find. Alison Roberts reports from the Portuguese capital.
The ship was found 7 metres down in a plot on which a hotel and apartment block are to be built. It's said by experts to be unusual as key parts of it, including the keel, bow and rudder, were found largely intact. As the best conserved ship of the period ever found in Portugal, it offers huge research potential. The National Culture Directorate has said that the ship must be fully excavated and dismantled, with the process systematically recorded before building on the plot can go ahead. The team of archaeologists has also found other objects, some dating back to ancient Roman times.
And that's the latest BBC News.
I'm Gareth Barlow. You're listening to The Newsroom from the BBC World Service. We start in the UK, where last April, 48-year-old London bus driver Nadir Noor died with COVID-19. Pat Midgley was 82 when she lost her life. Emma Clark, 35. Hilda Churchill survived the Spanish flu pandemic, but died with COVID at the age of 108. Luca De Nicola, an aspiring chef, was only 19. There are few of the individuals among the just over 100,000 that government figures show have now died in the UK within 28 days of a positive coronavirus test. When the pandemic began, experts in Britain said 20,000 deaths would be a good outcome. Speaking in the last couple of hours, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, struck a sombre tone.
I'm sorry to have to tell you that today the number of deaths recorded from COVID in the UK has surpassed 100,000. And it's hard to compute the sorrow contained in that grim statistic. The years of life lost, the family gatherings not attended, and for so many relatives, the missed chance even to say goodbye.
The UK has one of the highest death rates of any developed country, and it's the current second wave, the one that's happening now, today, that's been far deadlier than the first. Today, 1,631 deaths were reported. So how did Britain get here? Our health correspondent Jim Reid has this report.
Now, the World Health Organization is warning that a new respiratory virus in China...
It all started so calmly as the first reports of a new disease emerged from China.
I don't want to get alarmist, but just how worrying is this?
By the end of January, the first cases were found in the UK. By March, the first British death was recorded. At a press conference that month, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, tried to sound reassuring.
I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody.
3 weeks later, the official death toll hit 500. Rules were tightened, but cases kept rising. By the end of March, the Prime Minister's tone was very different.
I must level with the British public. Many more families are going to lose loved ones before their time.
I called him the morning of the day he passed away, and he waved and he said, "Bye, Jamie," and I said, "Bye, Daddy." I never thought he wouldn't come home.
Jamie's father, Richard Nabiu, died on April the 10th. By the time Richard lost his life, the official death toll was more than 13,000. But the first wave of the pandemic had started to peak, and the numbers dying each day had started to fall.
Bonsoir. Excusez-nous, est-ce que vous avez des masques?
The European summer came, and with it a semblance of normality as restrictions were eased. People went on holiday. A generous government subsidy boosted the restaurant trade.
Absolutely packed every single night. Last night, 300 customers all left satisfied and very, very happy.
In the background, though, the virus was still present. British care homes in particular were hit hard. A quarter of all deaths took place there.
Da, da, da. Da, 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 da.
Ada Jackson was 90 years old. Her granddaughter Andrea said she was lively and feisty until the virus entered her care home.
It started to go from one person to 3 people to 5 people. You then started to just think, my goodness, they're not going to be able to stop this. They had the residents locked in their room, and the impact is huge.
As the temperatures cooled in the autumn, a second wave of the pandemic took hold. Then in December, news of a mutation in the virus.
Spread is now being driven by the new variant of the virus, which does appear to be passed on significantly more easily.
The government imposed extra restrictions, at first just in London and the South East, cancelling Christmas celebrations for millions. By the end of the year, the number who had lost their lives reached 76,000.
Happy birthday to you.
That included Madula Sawa, who turned 50 years old last year. She and her husband were both in hospital with COVID at the same time.
That was the last time I saw her. She was so beautiful. She was so pretty. She was so beautiful, the way she was looking when she came to my life. So that's the most precious memory I have.
More than 100,000 lives have been lost to the virus in a country of 65 million people. By every measure, it leaves the United Kingdom with one of the highest death rates in the world. There are early signs that infections are starting to fall, and the vaccination programme appears to be off to a strong start. But nobody thinks life can return to normal for many months to come.
Jim Reid reporting. So what is the general mood like in the UK? How are people coping? I asked our political correspondent, Rob Watson.
It's a very good question to ask. And, only this morning I was talking to my family, to my wife and my 2 children, and we were reflecting on just how strange life in the UK is, that people aren't going to school, most businesses are shut down. I mean, this is quite extraordinary, and most people alive, not just in this country, but of course in many other European and other countries, have never experienced anything like this, such a disruption to everyday life. So, this is about as far from normal as life in the UK gets.
And the UK is now in its 3rd lockdown. The number of deaths still very high. Tens of thousands of people in hospital, over 4,000 people on ventilators. Why has the UK done so badly?
We'll have to wait, of course, until there's an official inquiry, which we don't have a date for, but we think there are 3 broad reasons very quickly. The first is partly the UK is very global. It's very connected to the rest of the world. So when the infection came at the start of 2020, it came to all parts of the UK and it came quickly. The second area might be what you would call government mistakes, and there are 3 of them. Essentially, that the government was rather slow on every occasion to put in place lockdowns. Secondly, the government did a poor job in protecting the special homes we have for the elderly. And thirdly, it did a poor job of setting up a track and trace system to make sure that when there were outbreaks that you kept it restricted. On top of all of that are underlying societal conditions. So you have in the UK high levels of poverty, high levels of underlying diseases such as obesity. This is also a very dense urban population. So you have lots of people crammed together, and in many cases, of course, in multi-generational households. So it's a combination of reasons that's put Britain in this ugly position.
You can't change global Britain, you can't change society, but the government can change what it does. How is it doing now?
The government is hoping, I don't think there's much doubt about this, that this is a crisis where it wants people to remember how it ended, and it wants the ending to be that Britain did a good job on the vaccines, as the government would see it, as an unadulterated good news story for the UK, that it was ahead of other European countries that had stayed in the EU in rolling out the vaccine, and that, of course, that Britain had a part in inventing one of the vaccines, and that people will therefore forget the start of the pandemic. Public opinion polling suggests that confidence in the government's handling of this crisis has plummeted since the start in March 2020. But interestingly, if you were Boris Johnson, you might draw some comfort from the polling which suggests that the governing Conservative Party is still in the lead.
Our UK political correspondent, Rob Watson. Well, people in the UK and around the world may be growing increasingly frustrated with coronavirus restrictions. But in the Philippines, children and young teenagers haven't even been allowed out of their homes for 10 months. They'd expected a reprieve this week, but that's been cancelled. And stay-at-home orders are also in place for the elderly too. The country's president, Rodrigo Duterte, told a news conference he'd abandoned plans to grant some age groups permission to go outside because of the danger posed by a new variant of the virus.
Those older ones are difficult to manage. They can watch TV the whole day. Sorry, but it's a precaution. I'm just afraid because this new strain strikes the young children.
Our Asia-Pacific regional editor, Michael Bristow, has been following the story.
For the last 10 months, children under the age of 15 have been essentially confined, cooped up in their homes. Now, some parents have been allowing their kids to go out and play in the parks, in the street, but essentially that's illegal. The law says they should be inside in order to stop the spread of the coronavirus. Now, just last week, last Friday, the authorities in the Philippines said they were lessening those restrictions for one particular age group, children aged 10 to 14. From February, they said those children will be allowed to go outside the home for the first time legally. But now Mr. Duterte has rescinded that order and said, no, you've got to stay at home. He's done that because in the Philippines, they've discovered the more contagious British variant of the virus. And Mr. Duterte says it's just too dangerous to allow them out. He told children to go back and watch the TV.
How on earth are families managing with this? Like you say, 10 months. That technically and legally, these children haven't been able to leave their homes.
The government has sent out some educational materials, both printed and digital. Some children logging in online to do their schoolwork. TV and radio programs are being directed at school kids so they can carry on learning. But it's a really difficult task. Remember, there are a lot of people in the Philippines who are quite poor, a lot of income inequality there. So particularly the poor end of the spectrum, kids are just going to be falling way behind on their schooling. Their mental health as well will also be suffering. Interestingly, though, the authorities, when they announced the change, so 10 to 14-year-olds will be allowed to go out before it was rescinded, they essentially justified that in terms of economics, not just in terms of kids' welfare. They were saying that a lot of families are now not going out and spending because, of course, on a weekend, families would take their children to the shopping centres or restaurants, that kind of thing. Of course, they can't do that now. So that's had a real impact on the economy. So when they announced children could go out, it was in economic terms, not in terms of their well-being.
Michael Bristow. This is the BBC World Service. Julie has the headlines.
The number of coronavirus deaths in the UK has passed 100,000, the highest in Europe. The Philippines has scrapped plans to allow children to leave their homes for the first time since March, and the US Senate has confirmed the veteran diplomat Antony Blinken as Secretary of State.
Yes, Mr. Blinken, who's worked with President Biden for many years, received strong bipartisan support. The Senate also confirmed the appointment of the first woman to head the US Treasury, Janet Yellen. Our Washington correspondent, Gary O'Donoghue, has been following the day's appointments, starting with Ms. Yellen.
They're talking about $1.9 trillion worth of coronavirus legislation that they're trying to get through. That will be her principal goal. She's already talked about the money that's already been spent, which is almost $4 trillion. It's a kind of down payment. And now that the real business of getting the economy back on its feet is going to take trillions more. The Democrats do have the ability to push that thing through with their own votes, possibly, if they can't get Republican support. But there are some Democrats who don't like things in that bill either. So it's not going to be an easy passage for Janet Yellen in terms of that legislation. And Joe Biden said when he won the presidency that America was back. And what he meant by that was America would start to re-engage in the multilateral institutions and relationships that Donald Trump had retreated from. And Tony Blinken is very much in that mold. He's career foreign service. He knows the State Department inside out. He's a sort of Europhile, pro-European, if you like, and all that kind of thing. So there will be this collective sigh of relief in capitals in Europe and around the world that he has been confirmed and he will be in place, because they will be able to deal with America, quite frankly, in a much more predictable way than they've been able to in the last 4 years.
Gary O'Donoghue. The Nigerian president, Muhammadu Buhari, has replaced all 4 of his most senior military chiefs. He hasn't explained why, but Nigeria has suffered mounting security problems across the entirety of the country. I've been speaking to our Africa regional editor, Grant Ferret.
Mr. Buhari has given nothing away in terms of his thinking about why he sacked these people. There were 2 tweets, and he said that he'd accepted their immediate resignations, thanked them for what he called their overwhelming achievements, and then simply named their replacements. I think the question many Nigerians will have is, why didn't Mr. Buhari act before? He's been under pressure for months, if not years, to replace the top military chiefs. He'd been in power, himself for 6 years now. He took office in 2015, and in that time, Nigeria's many security problems have just got worse and worse. And I think there was an expectation before he took office that as a former general himself, that he'd be the man to tackle these problems, but so far that simply hasn't proved to be the case.
When it comes to security in Nigeria and insecurity in Nigeria, Boko Haram is obviously the most well-known and the most high-profile threat, but the country really is a mosaic of instability.
Yes, Boko Haram have continued to launch attacks, mainly in Borno, up in the northeast of Nigeria, despite Mr. Buhari's insistence years ago that they'd been technically defeated. If anything, I think the army in the region has withdrawn into its bases, and that's made villagers and other residents in the area more exposed to Boko Haram's attacks. But if you look more widely, there are security problems just about in every corner of Nigeria now. Kidnappings have long been a problem down in the delta in the south of Nigeria. Kidnapping by criminal gangs is now much more of a problem up in the northwest. Many people will remember the kidnapping of those 300 schoolboys up in Katsina. That's Mr. Buhari's home state. Back in December, there was a kidnapping at the weekend in Abuja, the capital, or just outside, from an orphanage. That caused quite a lot of shock. And there's another more sort of long-running security challenge, which has caused huge disruption across Nigeria's middle belt, across the centre of the country. And that's over land and grazing rights between cattle herders and farmers. That problem's never been resolved in Nigeria, and if anything, that one too is getting worse. So these new armed forces chiefs have got a huge, huge task ahead of them.
The BBC's Grant Ferret. To India now, where security in the capital Delhi has been ramped up after a huge protest by farmers descended into violence. Hundreds of thousands of demonstrators converged on the city, angry at proposed agricultural reforms that they fear will undermine guaranteed prices for crops and allow large corporations to exploit producers. Farmers broke through barricades, pushing buses aside with tractors and clashing with the police. One protester died and several officers were hurt. Our South Asia correspondent Rajini Vaidyanathan sent this report from Delhi.
The day began peacefully as tens of thousands of farmers made their way towards Delhi on tractors, by foot, and some even on horseback. But things soon turned violent. As the protesters entered the capital, barricades were breached. Tear gas was deployed. Marchers and police were left injured. The farmers are opposing a law they fear will drive them out of business. The government says the reforms will benefit them by allowing them to sell directly to big business. Protesters like Sukhdev Singh fear the guaranteed prices they get for some crops will eventually disappear.
These laws will have an effect on anyone who eats. If corporates are allowed to come in, they will buy from us at a very low price, and we'll lose our livelihoods.
This has become the biggest challenge facing the country's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, who today hosted the country's Republic Day parade. Many say the populist leader misread this crisis. It's unlikely the events of today will bring both sides closer to an agreement. The farmers say they won't give up until the laws are repealed.
Rajini Vaidyanathan. Now, Julie has more of the world's news.
The Dutch finance minister says a third night of rioting triggered by a coronavirus curfew will not alter his government's policy. Wopke Hoekstra said there could be no capitulation to people who smash shop windows. There's been unrest in several Dutch cities since a 9 p.m. curfew came into effect on Saturday. Thousands of teachers in France have been holding demonstrations across the country to demand better working conditions during the pandemic. Unlike many other European countries, France has kept its schools open this month, although university students are learning remotely and want more face-to-face classes. Chelsea Football Club have confirmed that the former Paris Saint-Germain coach Thomas Tuchel will become their new manager. The The 47-year-old German has agreed an 18-month contract. He replaces Frank Lampard, who was sacked following a poor run of results.
The President of the European Commission has warned coronavirus vaccine manufacturers they must deliver on their promises and their vaccines after both AstraZeneca and Pfizer announced cuts in their supplies to the European Union. Ursula von der Leyen said all exports of vaccines will be monitored to ensure EU countries got their fair share. And the rows over supplies brings sharp focus to the fact that these are the most sought-after vaccines in history. The World Health Organization is now worried that poorer countries will suffer most from what it calls vaccine nationalism. But as our correspondent Naomi Grimley explains, the experts trying to distribute millions of doses to the developing world have a plan to mitigate against this.
Talk of export bans or protectionism with vaccines comes as no surprise to those who've been trying to make sure the world's poorest countries can at least get their healthcare workers vaccinated. Everyone who works in global health is scarred by the unseemly scramble for swine flu vaccines in 2009. This time, the UN-sponsored programme COVAX was set up precisely to avoid that by using diverse supply chains. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is being made around the world, so the poorest countries will get their supplies from India or Brazil or South Korea, not Belgium or the UK. Next week, we'll hear about the latest efficacy results for a new vaccine made by Johnson & Johnson. It's a one-dose jab, and if that works, it will make life much easier for fragile states. As the pandemic continues, there's a growing realisation amongst world leaders that it's not enough to tackle the virus in wealthy nations. But the goal of vaccinating entire adult populations, as the UK intends to do, remains way out of reach for most middle and low-income countries.
Naomi Grimley. President Biden is to push forward with plans to make the anti-slavery activist Harriet Tubman the face of the new $20 bill. His predecessor, Donald Trump, branded the idea pure political correctness. Charlotte Gallagher has the story.
Harriet Tubman was born into slavery in the early 1820s, but in 1849 she managed to escape, fleeing a plantation in Maryland and crossing into the state of Pennsylvania where slavery was illegal. Years later, she reflected on the moment when she arrived safely, saying she felt like she was in heaven. After securing her own freedom, she helped others escape, putting herself in great danger by returning to her home state and guiding people along the so-called Underground Railroad, a network of safe houses. It's believed Harriet Tubman helped around 300 people escape slavery. When the Civil War broke out, she became a spy, gathering information for the Union government from behind enemy lines. The US Treasury announced in 2016 that Harriet Tubman would be the face of the new $20 bill, but the plans were delayed by Donald Trump, who branded them politically correct. The new White House press secretary, Jen Psaki, says the proposal has now been revived.
It's important that our notes reflect the history and diversity of our country, and Harriet Tubman's image gracing the new $20 note would certainly reflect that. So we're exploring ways to speed up that effort.
Harriet Tubman would be the first African American ever and the first woman in over a century to appear on a US banknote. The man she'd be replacing on the $20 bill is the former President Andrew Jackson, who owned slaves, brought them to the White House to serve him, and opposed abolishing slavery.
Charlotte Gallagher reporting. And while we've been on air in just the last few moments, President Biden has been speaking about his hopes of improving racial equality across the US.
We are not just morally deprived because of systemic racism. We're also less prosperous. We're less successful. We're less secure. So we must change. And I know it's going to take time, but I know we can do it. And I firmly believe the nation is ready to change. But government has to change as well. We need to make equity and justice part of what we do every day.
We'll have more on that at 22 GMT.
Thank you for being with us here on the BBC World Service. Next, you can hear the latest sports news, and in 30 minutes, Republican voters in Idaho reflect on President Trump's legacy.
I will miss Donald Trump. The things that he did and the way he conducted the country, I think, is better than any president for a long time.
Then we're bringing you Digital Planet. Here's Gareth Mitchell.
In Malawi, a smartphone app is saving lives by helping tackle rabies. The app gathers crucial data about dogs in an area, and that helps local specialists target their vaccination programs.
At 23 GMT, we hear about the spacesuits saving new mothers' lives.
A woman could be bleeding, and it would take weeks, if she could survive it, to get to a hospital, to get a blood transfusion, to have the surgery. So it seemed like a brilliant thing.
That's all still to come from the BBC World Service.
Hello, I'm Adi Adedoyin, and this is Sport Today on the BBC World Service. I'm grateful to now be part of the Chelsea family. It feels amazing. The words of Thomas Tuchel, who's been appointed as the club's new manager on an 18-month contract. He'll be in the dugout for tomorrow's Premier League match against Wolves. Tonight, Manchester City can move to the top of the table for the first time this season. We'll also be looking ahead to the Milan derby in Italy. All on Sport Today. Join us in the next 2 minutes.
BBC News with Julie Candler. The number of coronavirus deaths in Britain has passed 100,000, the highest in Europe. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson acknowledged there were lessons to learn, but insisted his government had done everything it could to save lives. Britain's chief medical officer warned there would be many more coronavirus deaths before the benefits of a vaccination programme were felt. The veteran diplomat Antony Blinken has been confirmed as US Secretary of State in a Senate vote. He's promised to repair alliances strained by Donald Trump's America First approach. Janet Yellen has been sworn in as the first woman to lead the US Treasury, both received bipartisan support. The Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari has sacked all 4 of the country's top military officials. He gave no explanation, but the security situation is deteriorating in many parts of the country. A Polish man who was at the centre of a row between Poland and the UK over a decision to remove his life support has died in an English hospital. He was in a vegetative state after a cardiac arrest. His wife and a British court had agreed that he should be moved into palliative care, but other family members and the Polish government said his right to life must be preserved. The German coach Thomas Tuchel has been named the new manager of the English Premier League football side Chelsea. Tuchel was previously in charge of Paris Saint-Germain and Borussia Dortmund. He replaces Frank Lampard, who became the latest in a long line of Chelsea managers to be sacked. Archaeologists in Portugal say the discovery of a nearly complete 17th century ship offers great potential for new research into shipbuilding techniques of the period. The ship was discovered with its keel, bow and rudder intact 7 metres down on a riverside plot near Lisbon, but it'll have to be dismantled to be examined. BBC News.
Over the wall!